How's it going, everyone? Brainchild here, and for this video I'll be dissecting some of the more technical aspects of Smash Ultimate's visuals. Today my analysis is going to be based on the rendering differences between the Smash Wii U and Smash Ultimate stages that John compared in a previous video. Now keep in mind that the game is still in development, so things are always subject to change the closer we get to release, but from what I can see at this moment, Smash Ultimate seems to be a pretty substantial upgrade over the previous iterations of Smash. Well, in terms of rendering technology at least. So I think an early look at the game's tech is worth pursuing in this case. Having said that, let's hop right in, shall we? Alright, first up we have Dreamland, originally from the Smash Bros. Game on the N64. So immediately what jumps out to me here is the contrast in the Ultimate version of this stage. In addition to that, we can see the illusion of specular lighting on this tree trunk here, something that's kinda lacking on the tree trunk in the Wii U version. I mean, it's just barely there, but the diffuse component almost masks it completely. Now keep in mind that these stages were designed to preserve the original look of the N64 stages, so there's not going to be an incredible amount of additional detail here, but there does appear to be a few slight differences. One thing that doesn't appear to have changed in the Ultimate version is the background, which appears to be nearly identical to the Wii U version. However, that similarity seems to be overshadowed by the increase in geometry and texture detail that we can see in the Ultimate version. And again, the most noticeable change I can see in the Ultimate version of this stage is the increase in specularity on the tree trunk and some of the leaves on the tree. And when I say specularity, I'm referring to the degree to which a material appears to be specularly reflective, which is to say that some light rays intersecting with a given material bounce in mirror-like directions, resulting in mirror-like reflections of the environment and existing light sources. Now we're not going to see mirror-like reflections on this tree because the level of diffuse reflections, that is, reflections of incident light rays that bounce equally in all directions and produce a general color in the material instead of a mirror-like reflection, are much more prominent in materials like wood. However, almost no material is truly Lambertian or perfectly diffuse, so the specular reflections on most diffuse materials like wood usually appear as brighter patches of light on the part of the surface of the material that's angled most directly towards the light source that's illuminating the material's surface. So in this case of the tree trunk, even though it's mostly diffuse, the tree has convex curvature, meaning that most of its surface is going to be angled away from the light source rather than towards it in this case, resulting in less light appearing to reflect toward the viewer around the sides of the trunk than in the middle of the trunk. And that's assuming that the viewer is looking at the trunk from a position where the light source can be inferred to be directly behind the viewer. Another thing to note aside from the increased specularity and contrast is the increased saturation of color in the Ultimate version. Okay, on to the next stage. So here with Hyrule Castle, there appears to be proper directional lighting in the Ultimate version of the stage. However, if you look at the shadows underneath the platforms here, you can see that they're kinda fake. Doesn't matter whether they're in shadow or not in shadow, the appearance of these shadows between both versions is exactly the same, which is fine. I mean, this is an older stage, so it doesn't really need to be 100% physically accurate, and you can see even in the Ultimate version, the fakeness of these platform shadows has been preserved for artistic purposes, even with the inclusion of proper directional lighting. Now what I mean by directional lighting is that it represents how all of the rays in a given scene are parallel with one another, moving in a single direction while illuminating the environment and all objects within the environment in the same direction, kind of like how the sun does in real life. Technically, in real life, the sun is not actually a directional light source because it emits rays in every direction, making it much more like a very powerful spherical area light. However, since the sun is pretty far away from Earth, the rays that have managed to reach Earth's surface had to have been traveling in the same direction in order to have made it to the same destination, and since light rays travel in straight lines, these light paths can be considered parallel with each other, illuminating everything in the same direction. Subsequently, all shadows in such scenarios are cast in the same direction as well, as shadows are simply the areas on a surface that lack direct illumination from a light source. So to put this more succinctly, as a result of directional lighting, shadows become directional as well. Aside from the directional lighting, it looks like the background in the Ultimate version has a little bit more detail. If you look at the vegetation by the lake in the background, there appears to be more foliage and detailed houses in the Ultimate version of this stage. I'm not sure if they just touched up the original asset or painted an entirely new one, but the backgrounds between the two versions are definitely not the same. Next up we have Peach's Castle. Again, we have directional light, shadows, and even self-shadows, which is a shading technique where objects can cast shadows onto the surfaces of the objects from which the shadows are being cast, as we can see in this example with this plant casting its own shadow onto itself. And while we have this close-up view of this plant, another thing I'd like to point out is how the Wii U version of the plants and other elements on this stage use sprites, while it would appear that those sprites have been replaced with proper 3D models this time around in the Ultimate version. Quite the ultimate makeover, if I do say so myself. Another part of this stage that appears to have gotten a literal facelift would be these floating platforms here. The circles on the surface of the platforms have been raised in the Ultimate version due to them being made up of actual polygons instead of a flat texture now. And really, the entire stage in the Ultimate version has seen a significant improvement in geometry and texture detail compared to the Wii U version. So here we have Kongo Jungle. Again, much better saturation in the Ultimate version. The specularity, in this case shininess of the foliage, appears to have increased in the Ultimate version compared to the Wii U version. And if you look at the background in the Ultimate version, right underneath the sun here, we can see some additional vegetation that is clearly absent in the Wii U version, which makes this setting feel even more jungle-like. Fancy that. Now if we zoom out a bit here, we can also see some directional shadows have been added to the stage, suggesting that the primary light source of this stage is coming from a position close to the sun, even though the shiny specular highlights on the leaves would suggest that a different but equally powerful light source is coming from in front of the stage. Does this mean that in the world of Kongo Jungle, there exists two suns orbiting the same path, but opposite each other like binary stars? So here we have Temple, directional lighting, shadows. The ambient occlusion looks to be a bit more accurate in the Ultimate version. And for those who are confused about what ambient occlusion is, a simple way to think about it is when you look at a shadow, you notice in most cases that it's not perfectly black. You can still see some of the detail on the surface that's covered in shadow. The reason for this is due to indirect lighting, or light that bounces off one surface onto another surface. In computer graphics, one way to represent light bouncing around a scene is to use a crude approximation called ambient lighting, which approximates the effects of indirect lighting by giving the entire scene a uniformed and fixed level of diffuse color and intensity, which eventually makes its way into these areas that are blocked off from direct illumination of light sources. And these blocked off areas are called shadows. And since ambient light can come from any direction, it can easily make its way into all of these shadows in the scene, slightly illuminating them with a fixed but low intensity color. However, it is actually possible to block off some or even most ambient light as well, either by having objects inside of a shadow be placed in close proximity to another surface already in shadow, thus limiting the potential light paths the ambient rays can take to reach the shaded surface, or by having surfaces in shadow with cracks and crevices that have spaces so small and closed off that only a small amount of rays are likely to make it through, significantly decreasing illumination in such spaces. When direct light is blocked off and unable to reach a certain space or surface, it's known as occlusion. So naturally, when ambient light is blocked off and unable to reach certain spaces in shaded areas, it is referred to as ambient occlusion. And the precision of that ambient occlusion appears to have been improved in the Ultimate version of this stage. There also appears to be some kind of global illumination in the Ultimate version. Now, as for what that entails, conceptually it's kind of similar to ambient lighting in that its illumination of surfaces is the result of rays bouncing from one surface to another surface after said rays have directly illuminated prior surfaces. What makes global illumination different from ambient lighting, however, is that global illumination has to account for the stages of light bouncing between surfaces where specific colors of a specific surface can be seen transferring to adjacent surfaces in a very localized way, which we can see here in the Ultimate version, while clearly absent in the Wii U version. Also, ambient lighting, as using computer graphics, isn't really a thing in real life. No environment has truly uniform color and intensity, even if it can appear that way after so many light bounces. But as long as it's close enough to the real deal, most people are usually okay with it. Okay, so now that we've just finished a poor man's crash course in light physics and real-time lighting and computer graphics, we should probably get back on track here. So it looks like a couple of the other significant changes I can see in the Ultimate version are some improvements in the overall scene geometry and some improvements in texture detail. Alright, Melee's Yoshi's Island. So right off the bat, what I'm noticing here is that the color of the puddle of water underneath the green pipe in the Ultimate version is actually matching the color of the sky now, which is nice. That's definitely a thing that happens in real life. Here we can see that specular highlights, which are basically mirror-like reflections of the light source that's illuminating the respective materials, are present in the Ultimate version, but not in the Wii U version. The highlights are also relatively physically accurate. And there's a pretty significant reason for this. During the early production phase of Ultimate's development, Bandai Namco started working on a new renderer for the game. And the game's engine eventually incorporated a modern rendering pipeline we programmers commonly refer to as physically based rendering. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time explaining how physically based rendering works, but I'll go over a few key points to help you understand why many of the lighting changes in Ultimate seem like such drastic improvements over Smash for Wii U's lighting system. Basically, with physically based rendering, artists are able to light materials, which are the textured surfaces of objects, more accurately and efficiently because the tools used in physically based workflows can automatically enforce lighting models and material characteristics derived from the real world, and seamlessly and comprehensively integrate them into the rendering pipeline. Artists no longer have to paint their texture maps with specific lighting scenarios in mind for each individual texture. With physically based rendering, their materials just work in any lighting condition. Now, PBR artists will still have control over many material parameters, so it's still possible to author materials that don't quite look right compared to real life, but generally speaking, these parameters will still have to conform to the natural behavior of light and its interaction with matter as modeled after the physics of the real world. So when using physically based rendering correctly, you're not going to find materials like unvarnished wood being especially specularly reflective, nor will you find materials like polished metal being especially diffusely reflective. And as long as you have properly calibrated and parameterized materials under a physically based workflow, they really shouldn't ever defy the laws of physics, so to speak, regardless of the lighting scenarios or art styles that you might set them in. In this case of the specular highlight on this green pipe, the engine's algorithms have taken the smoothness of the pipe's material into account to determine that the specularity of the highlight should be hard, which gives us the shininess that we can clearly see. The curvature of the pipe has also been taken into account so that the reflection of the light source is distorted into a shape of a line instead of the circles that you would typically expect to see on shiny surfaces where the source of the light that it's reflecting is spherical. Now, normally with a specular highlight this bright and relatively sharp, you would expect to also see some environment reflections on such a surface. However, this pipe is actually made out of plastic, which presents a special scenario for the renderer. The material of plastic itself can be very specularly reflective due to its smoothness, but it's also pretty transparent in its base form, causing light rays to effectively pass through its surface at certain angles so that when viewing such surfaces, you can only really see reflections of the environment when the angles are in line with a parallel view. Now, since these pipes are curved, that means we can actually view its surface at many angles at once, which is pretty useful since we want to see a gradual change in reflectivity when shifting from a perpendicular view of the surface to a parallel view of the surface without the need to manipulate the camera. In the case of these pipes, we have a parallel view of their surface right along their edges. Looking along the edges of this pipe in particular, we can see just barely the water below being reflected along the edge of the pipe. As a side note, I should mention that many rendering engineers use math-evolving Fresnel coefficients to design shaders that allow materials to change their reflectivity depending on the material's microfacet details and index of refraction, which is what we're seeing here. Now, you might be wondering why the edges of the pipes aren't reflecting more of the environment, but keep in mind that the camera is set above these pipes, looking down at them, and isn't perfectly level with the ground, so from our vantage point, most of the environment that we'll be able to see reflected along the edges of these pipes will be coming from underneath them. On top of that, there's the issue of the plastic material itself. While it's true that in essence plastic is transparent, that doesn't really tell us the whole story. Many plastic materials are injected with colorants in order to give them opacity and color, and it is this internally rough dye or pigment that causes diffuse reflections within plastic. So with this pipe, the appearance of its specular highlight is represented as the result of light rays intersecting with the smoothly transparent outer layer of the plastic, while the diffuse green color of the pipe is represented as the result of light rays intersecting with rough colorants deeper within the plastic. Essentially, this pipe is a representation of two materials that cause light to behave very differently between them. In reality, there aren't actually two layers of materials on this pipe in the renderer, though there are multiple material maps whose channels can utilize different shading techniques to achieve the desired result. In other words, taking advantage of such techniques, the renderer has effectively achieved a result that accounts for the combined effects of layered materials on a single object without actually needing to use multiple materials. Pretty neat, huh? Now looking at the water here, there appears to be a local reflection of the green pipe along its surface, but it's kind of hard to make that out in this screenshot. So looking at the stage pit here, it looks like we can see some subtle instances of ambient occlusion in the ultimate version. Now here's a curious change. It looks like the trees in the ultimate version of the stage are round now compared to the rather flat look of the trees in the Wii U version. In addition to that, we are once again looking at a noticeable increase in geometry, texture detail, and color saturation. Here we have Onet, or Onet, or OneNet if you take the word of some Earthbound fans who take this lore stuff way too seriously. So again, we can see a lot more saturation in the Ultimate version. I mean, just look at the difference between the yellow house and the Ultimate version compared to the Wii U version. Speaking of that yellow house, it looks like they finally fixed the occlusion problem under the red overhang above the door in the Ultimate version. If you look at the Wii U version, you can see that the lighting underneath this overhang here makes no sense. If there's a surface obstructing direct light, that direct light should not be visible within occluded regions that are cast by that surface. Physically, it's just not possible. Thankfully, this issue has been fixed in the Ultimate version. In fact, you can see that the area below the overhang is darker than the shadow above the overhang, as part of the top side of the overhang is exposed to direct, indirect, and ambient light, while none of the underside of the overhang is exposed to direct light, but is exposed to some ambient and indirect light. This is a pretty good example of how well indirect lighting and ambient occlusion have been implemented in this game. So shifting our gaze to the background for a moment, I'm kinda surprised that the houses appear to be completely different between both versions of the stage. Not only are the assets different, but it would seem as if the developers have intentionally designed the houses to look different from the houses of the original version. Interesting. There also appears to be some sort of building in the foreground of the Ultimate version that's absent in the Wii U version. Not really sure what the significance of adding that would be, other than to give the stage a more three-dimensional feel, I suppose, but a curious little detail nonetheless. Alright, on to Bridge of Eldin. So right off the bat, I'm looking at a significant increase in geometry here, as well as additional trees in the background. And if you take a closer look at these trees that are far in the distance, you can see that they even cast shadows of varying degrees of fall off, which is pretty cool considering that most players are probably never going to notice this. There also appears to be lots of mountainous terrain, and in the foreground here we can see some nice ambient occlusion underneath this volunteer growth. Looking at the sky here, it looks like the size of the sun in the Ultimate version is a lot more realistic based on its position in the sky. The same can be said for the color gradients of the sky in the Ultimate version as well, which were painted in a way that approximates Rayleigh scattering, which is an optical phenomenon where light rays scatter through the sky's atmosphere and can cause the sky's color to range from bluish to orangish depending on the sun's position in the sky. And again, there's significantly increased geometry and texture detail throughout the entire scene, which is a theme that we're seeing with a lot of these stages so far. So here we have Wind Waker and Wind Waker HD. No, I'm just kidding, this is Pirate Ship. So it looks like there's some sky bloom bleeding onto the ocean in the Ultimate version of the stage, though for some people that might not necessarily be an improvement if there are complaints about Wind Waker HD's visuals or anything to go by. We can also see some Fresnel in the Ultimate version on parts of the ship where your angle of view of the surface ranges from oblique to straight angles. Or another way to put this is if your view of a surface was one that shifted from a perpendicular head-on view of that surface, also known as the surface normal, to a parallel view of that surface, which is called a grazing angle, you would see a shift in the surface's reflectivity as well, resulting in the surface becoming brighter the closer you approach that parallel plane, which is what we can see happening here and something we were also able to observe on the green pipes in the Melee Yoshi's Island stage as well. And as a quick aside, with physically based rendering, the representation of how light interacts with a material is handled by bidirectional reflectance distribution functions, Fresnel equations, and a given material's microfacet details and index of refraction, among other parameters. These lighting models, equations, and parameter values are usually derived from the real world, so as long as one uses a workflow that incorporates these principles and values, even when the microfacet details of a material are completely artist-driven, its reflectivity can be reasonably approximated, which is what we see happening with the materials in Smash Ultimate. So we can also see more pronounced directional lighting and shadows in the Ultimate version, as well as an improvement in geometry and texture detail. Okay, so for Delfino Plaza, aside from the much improved saturation, it looks like the entire stage in the background has been completely redone. These are entirely new assets authored with physically based materials. They might look similar at first glance, but upon closer inspection we can see that the texture pattern on the brickwork of the buildings in the Wii U version, for instance, has been replaced with actual geometry in the Ultimate version. The stone pattern on the cliff face in the background is totally different in the Ultimate version. The directional lighting has improved. The water rendering solution has also improved. In fact, it looks like water depth is factored into the visibility of the water now, which means that the deeper the water gets, the harder it is to see through it. So if you look at the water below this building in the Ultimate version, you cannot see deep below the surface, while the floor of the water is visible in the Wii U version. However, if you look at the beach in the Ultimate version, the water is even more transparent than the water in the Wii U version. The reason for this change in the Ultimate version is because the concept of water visibility becoming worse as it gets deeper, even if the water is completely free of foreign particles, is based on the physics of the real world. In real life, water as a substance is transparent, meaning that most light will effectively pass straight through it, which is pretty evident when you look at a glass of clean water. However, as transparent as water may be, it still scatters some light, just not enough to be visible to the naked eye in quantities as small as a glass of water. Nevertheless, the greater the volume of water, the greater the opportunity for some light rays to scatter back out of the water and into our eyes. And since the water volume of an ocean increases with its depth, the increased scatter of light results in an increase in apparent opacity. I say apparent opacity because the water molecules themselves aren't actually opaque, regardless of the volume that it has. It just appears that way due to the accumulation of so much light scatter over larger bodies of water. However, increased light scatter with increased water volume only gives us part of the reason why visibility in water becomes worse as it gets deeper. If there wasn't anything more to it than that, we could expect deep waters to be fairly bright with so much light scatter, but that's definitely not the case. One of the biggest reasons for poor water visibility in deep water, even if theoretically free of suspended particles, is that a medium like water requires light to expend more energy as it travels deeper and deeper below the water's surface. Since a wave of light doesn't carry an unlimited amount of energy, the more energy it expends, the more radiant power it loses, which subsequently degrades its light intensity in the process. This process is called light attenuation. So as you can imagine, if light loses more intensity as it travels deeper in the water, it's going to become increasingly more difficult to see through to the extent of the water's depth. I should mention that for Delfino Plaza's water, this depth-based opacity technique for water doesn't appear to be true to scale compared to real life. In real life, visible light can penetrate through clear water up to about 1,000 meters, or just over 3,200 feet, before the entire visible spectrum becomes completely absorbed. However, we aren't exactly privy to the chemical composition of the water in Delfino Plaza, so it's entirely possible that the turbidity or level of haziness plays a more significant role in the visibility of the water compared to our clear oceans in real life due to its unique chemical makeup. Alternatively, a small level of water turbulence could also explain the low visibility in its relatively shallow waters. But in that case, I wouldn't expect the water to be so pristinely blue, but hey, who knows? Anything's possible in a Mario game, right? By the way, if you thought that the ocean was blue because of the blue color of the sky, well, you, my friend, have been sold a pack of lies. Okay, not really. I mean, skylight does contribute somewhat to watercolor, but not very much, and people tend to overstate its contribution to watercolor due to the fact that water can reflect the sky like a mirror at certain angles. And while we're on the subject of watercolor, you might be asking yourself why the water in Delfino Plaza appears to become more blue the deeper it gets. Shouldn't it become more black as more light is absorbed by deeper water? Well, all color frequencies being equal, that very well could be the case. As it turns out, however, all color frequencies are not equal, as differences in frequencies of electromagnetic radiation is the result of differences in the amount of energy propagating at different light frequencies. Light waves comprised of yellow, orange, and red color frequencies have less energy to impart than light waves comprised of green, blue, and violet color frequencies. Due to these differences in potential energy across the electromagnetic spectrum, yellow, orange, and red light is easily absorbed in shallow water, while green light can penetrate shallow water but not much further beyond that, and blue light can penetrate far beneath the water surface up to about 1,000 meters. As for violet light, even though it has more energy than blue light and could theoretically travel below the water surface more than blue light could, the sun doesn't emit much violet light in the first place, and by the time the violet light that is emitted passes through the Earth's atmosphere, it loses most of its intensity. So when waves of violet light finally reach the surface of the water, it doesn't take much for the water to completely absorb them. Not to mention that our eyes are pretty poor at seeing visible violet light in the first place. Thanks, Mother Nature. So essentially, water becomes bluer the deeper the water gets because all the other colors gradually get absorbed over greater distances in the water, and blue light becomes more and more exclusive with increasing water depth. Having said that, after that 1,000 meter threshold, water does actually start to turn black. Once blue light has been absorbed, there's no visible light left to go any further. Viewing the ocean from the surface, however, we won't really see black water at most points in broad daylight due to at least some blue light scattering back out of the water at almost every point along the entire surface of a body of water, instead of traveling further down. In order to actually see most of the ocean's naturally black water during the daytime, you'd have to actually dive all the way down to the threshold where all light has been absorbed. And that concludes our lesson on the water absorption spectrum. No, but seriously, I do appreciate the changes made to the water rendering in this stage to bring it more in line with how light works with water in the real world. Very, very good attention to detail. Moving on. So for Castle Siege, it looks like the directional shadows have shifted a bit in the Ultimate version, but that's probably due to a change in the time of day more than anything else. What's interesting here is that we can see increased illumination in the parts of the shadows that are closest to the most interior points of the structure, while the parts of the shadows that lie outside of the structure have overall less illumination. This is actually a really good example of how, in the real world, the prominence of indirect lighting in an environment depends a lot on how closed off or open the surrounding area of a shaded surface is. In the corners of structures that block incoming direct light, or in small, closed interior locations, there is a higher concentration of interreflection of indirect rays and shadows, which makes the illumination of indirect lighting more noticeable in these areas. In very open areas where interreflection of indirect rays is more spread out, shadows tend to be darker and indirect lighting is less noticeable. Though in the case of overcast days with lots of cloud cover, the whole environment is in shadow, so indirect lighting plays a greater role in illuminating the environment. The ambient occlusion is fairly conspicuous in all of the cracks and crevices of this stage, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it gives the whole scene a bit more of a grounded look, so to speak. So I can dig it. I'm not sure what's going on with this faint beam of light here. Is this supposed to be some sort of sun streak or lens flare? Surely that can't be an actual atmospheric shaft of light, as it's pretty physically implausible for a light shaft in real life to form like that with no obstruction from the sun. I don't know, I'm not really a fan of the overexposed bloom lighting in this scene in general, but I do appreciate that the clouds are being lit properly, unlike the Wii U version. Too many games these days still manage to screw that up. Overall geometry, texture detail, and saturation have improved, and we even get some proper shadows for the trees in the background now, which really adds some much needed depth to this scene. Alright, so for Luigi's Mansion, we're gonna have to zoom in a little bit, but it looks like there are multiple local shadow casting light sources in each of these mansion rooms. Note how the position of the point light source in the scene causes the objects to cast shadows in multiple directions with varying levels of darkness. The local lighting here looks good. It looks damn good, and it makes me want a new Luigi's Mansion game ASAP. Though I could do without Luigi's soul getting utterly snatched by death. I still can't believe that's a thing that happened and Nintendo actually let it happen. Anyway, these lighting differences may not be that noticeable when the camera is zoomed out, but when comparing them to the Wii U version, you can see that it's a pretty dramatic improvement. On the roof here, it looks like the windows are more recessed than they were in the Wii U version. They also appear to transmit a very faint light through them, which is a nice touch. We can also see a nice subsurface scattering effect on these leaves here, which represents the real-life phenomenon of light scattering inside of a translucent material after intersecting with it, then exiting the material at a different point from which it entered. On these leaves, we can see the effect on the leaves exposed to the moonlight from behind, while the leaves that aren't as exposed to the moonlight don't exhibit the effect as strongly. And speaking of moonlight, check out the rim lighting along the edges of these trees thanks to the moon's illumination and properly implemented Fresnel coefficients. We can also see some rim lighting along the edges of the mansion's roof as well. Nice! That wraps up part 1 of our pre-release tech analysis for Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. But don't worry, there's still a lot more to uncover, so keep your eyes peeled for part 2 in the future. For now, let us know in the comments below which features you thought were the most interesting, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more videos on Smash Ultimate. Thanks for watching, and be sure to stay tuned to GameXplain for all things gaming. Cheers!